Good evening, community, and happy Halloween. This story happened to us precisely on that day, October 31st, the scariest day of our lives so far. My name is Antonio. I'm currently 29 years old, but when all this happened, I was barely 20. To give you some context, on October 30th, my two best friends, Alan and Jesus, and I were planning an urban exploration in a ghost town about 2 hours from where we lived. That town had been abandoned for over a century. The old houses were almost collapsing. Some were completely demolished. No one went there because it was somewhat hidden. In fact, many people didn't even know it existed. But since we lived so close, of course, we knew about it and were aware that some YouTubers had gone to explore it. They said the vibe was very bad, and strange things appeared in their videos while they were there. But we didn't believe any of it. We thought it was just sensationalism to make their videos go viral. We wanted to go and see for ourselves. Despite their warnings not to go because the emotional load and energy could be very heavy, we had the fantastic idea to go on the night of October 31st, on Halloween. We prepared a day before, telling our parents that we were going to a costume party and would be back late. So that evening, around 8 p.m., we hit the road to get there by 10 o'clock sharp. We were entering that town, which, by the way, was even worse than we had imagined. It was in very bad condition and completely dark. We could only see what the car's headlights illuminated. The houses looked very old, the ones that weren't already collapsed. We drove around the town to decide where to park the car and get out to explore a bit. We put on our jackets because it was very cold, which seemed odd to us since the weather in our city was pleasant, just a bit cool. But in that place, it was really cold. The three of us grabbed our flashlights and started walking. We were strolling along the sidewalks and had gotten quite far from the car. There was one thing we agreed on with those YouTubers who had been there. The vibe felt quite heavy. My back started to hurt, as if I were carrying someone on me. That's how heavy the atmosphere was. My friends also felt very tense, but that didn't stop us from continuing to explore the place. We were walking past some houses that were still standing when suddenly we heard something, murmurs coming from inside one of those old houses. I immediately turned and swear I saw a silhouette moving away from the upstairs window. I didn't get a good look at who it was, but I saw them retreat upon seeing us. I quietly informed my friends, and Jesus started walking into that house. We told him to come back, that someone might be inside and it could be dangerous. But he kept going in, urging us to go with him since that's what we came to the town for. We had no choice but to follow him. We couldn't let him go in there alone. We thought someone might be living there and didn't know what their intentions could be. So we went with him, walking very slowly and trying to make as little noise as possible. We walked among debris. The house was about to fall apart. We knew we were taking a big risk there. Some rubble could fall on our heads, or even worse, it could collapse. But we continued until we reached the stairs, and that's when something happened that left us paralyzed. We were going up. Jesus was first, Alan was behind, and I was in the middle. When Jesus had already reached the second floor, we both turned abruptly upon hearing Alan scream. We saw something grab his foot, dragging him down. We ran to help him. He was lying on the floor with blood coming from his nose and had hurt his knee badly. But instead of saying he was in pain, he was frantically shouting that something had pulled him. He was completely terrified. I told Jesus that we had to get out of there, that we needed to get back to the car so Alan could get in since he was injured. But Jesus gave us the keys and told us to go ahead, that he would go upstairs to see what was going on up there. Of course, we weren't going to leave him alone, so Alan and I stayed downstairs while he explored the entire upper part. He walked around, telling us there was no one there, while we shouted for him to come down, that we needed to leave. Honestly, I'm not lying when I say that I was feeling more and more pain in my back and also in my chest, as if someone were pressing it very hard. It was something I had never felt before and never felt again after that. It was as if whatever lived there wanted us to leave because we were invading its territory. Suddenly, Jesus stopped responding and we couldn't hear him walking anymore. I shouted for him to stop fooling around, that it wasn't funny, and to quit joking because Alan needed to get back to the car since he was badly hurt. But Jesus didn't respond. We couldn't even hear his footsteps among the debris or see the light of his flashlight. My heart started pounding very hard. I was getting more scared by the minute. Alan had a nervous breakdown. He wouldn't stop trembling and was crying nonstop, yelling curses at Jesus to come down already. But there was no sign of him. So I made the difficult and sinister decision to go up and look for him. Alan begged me to stay with him, not to leave him alone. But I knew Jesus could be in trouble since a lot of time had passed without any trace of him. I told Alan I promised I wouldn't take long and carefully went up the stairs, fearing the same thing that happened to Alan might happen to me. But I managed to get all the way up. Once there, the vibe was unbearable. If it was horrible downstairs, up there it felt much worse, something I had never experienced before. I didn't know where to go, so I walked to the right, taking small steps and shining my flashlight around, calling his name, telling him to come out from wherever he was, that we needed to leave immediately. But there was still no response. The place was sinister. There were very ugly things painted on the walls, satanic symbols and phrases written in languages I didn't recognize. It also smelled very bad, like something putrid. There were voodoo dolls among the debris. It was evident that the place was used for all kinds of horrible rituals. I was no longer interested in exploring. All I wanted was to find Jesus and get out of there. Suddenly I heard a blood-curdling scream. It was Jesus. It came from the other side of the second floor. So I ran over there and saw him lying on the floor in a fetal position, covering his head and asking for help. I rushed to lift him up and asked what had happened, where he had been all that time. But he couldn't speak. His face was filled with terror, his eyes wide open with a lost gaze. Tears were streaming down his face, but he couldn't express what he was feeling. I helped him down the stairs and shouted to Alan that it was time to go. I had them beside me, trying to help them walk since they were both in very bad shape. We finally reached the spot where our car was supposed to be, and it wasn't there. The first thing I thought was that it had been stolen. I tried to call my parents, but none of the three of us had cell phone signal. We were really overwhelmed. All I wanted was to break down and cry, but I stayed as strong as I could for my friends. We had to walk toward the exit of that town. It took us almost an hour to get there. Then we started walking along the highway to ask for help. Evidently, no one wanted to stop to help us, until finally an older gentleman pulled over and asked if we had been in an accident since he saw the condition my friends were in. I told him yes, that we just needed to get to our city and call our parents to pick us up. The man kindly let us get into his truck and took us to a place in my city. From there, I called my parents and they came for us. After the scolding they gave us, they demanded we tell them everything without lies. Of course, they didn't believe me since none of us had proof. It seemed like our phones hadn't recorded anything, which was very strange. But after going to that place, it didn't seem so far-fetched to me that this had happened. The car belonged to Jesus' dad, who was punished for months and had to work in addition to attending university to pay for it. And here's where it gets unsettling. During all that time, I hadn't had the opportunity to see my friend Jesus. But one day, I went to visit him. He looked very different, not the same adventurous and fun-loving young man he had always been. His face looked lifeless, without any enthusiasm, and he even looked thinner. He had lost his muscles since he used to go to the gym daily. First of all, I asked him how he was doing, and he told me he was fine, but even he didn't believe it. Then I had to ask him what happened that night, what he saw in that abandoned house that he never told us about and apparently never told anyone. His eyes started filling with tears, and he finally told me everything. I was walking and entered one of the rooms, but suddenly everything transformed. The house seemed inhabited. It had beautiful, very old furniture. There was a record player playing music. The walls had color, and it seemed like I was in another era, as if I had gotten lost in time. I didn't know what to do, so I turned off my flashlight since there were lamps lighting up the house, and I stood there petrified, observing everything. I was in front of a dining room. Suddenly, a family from that era came in to sit and eat there. Then a man who seemed to be the father entered. He had a bottle of alcohol in his hand, pulled an axe from behind his back and drove it into his wife's head, splitting her skull in two. Everything was covered in blood. The 3 children screamed and cried, and then he did the same to them. In the end, he took a knife from the table and simply ended his own life. I couldn't move. My body was completely paralyzed and I had to witness all of that. I couldn't even scream or cry. I just watched with a deep terror I had never felt before. Then I closed my eyes as tightly as I could and suddenly I was back on the floor in that same room, but everything was abandoned again. That's when you found me. I listened to him, astonished. Of course, it was something very hard to believe, but I saw his terrified face. I could see his body language as he relived everything he saw, and I knew he wasn't lying. I had known him since we were kids and knew he was telling the truth. Jesus also told me with his haggard face. I never told anyone because I knew they'd call me crazy, a liar. I would have done the same if you or Alan had told me something like that. You know I wouldn't have believed you. But it happened to me and I understand if you don't believe me. I replied that I did believe him, that I too had felt those horrible energies the whole time we were there, and not to forget what happened to Alan as well. He should have told us because we would have believed him since we experienced it too. This was the terrible exploration we had in that place, which was undoubtedly full of dark, evil, and terrifying things. At least we found out what happened in that house in those times, but we don't know what other secrets were hidden throughout that town. In general, the place was full of bad energies, and the cold we felt there was unreal. A few years later, we learned that they demolished everything and built some factories there. That cursed town no longer exists, although I wonder if strange or paranormal things happen in those factories, considering what that place was before. It's something I'll never know and I don't want to find out. I've never gone back there since that night, and it's something I will never do. Be very careful if one day you decide to do something like this and always listen to your intuition. Happy Halloween to all. Good evening. I would like to recount this story anonymously, as it is very intense and we are still not over what it caused within our circle of friends. It's something that happened one Halloween when my friends and I decided to enter an abandoned psychiatric hospital in the United States. I won't give my friends' names either, because I don't want to get them into trouble. Even though this happened in 2010, it's still hard for me to remember that day without getting goosebumps and feeling pain. I recall that night fell on a Saturday, and a friend from school had a costume party at his house and invited almost everyone from high school. He had a very big house and was almost always the host of all the parties. I arrived around 10 p.m., and there were very few people. Folks were just starting to arrive, all in costumes, and his house was decorated like a haunted mansion. His family had money, so all the decorations were excellent. Our friends began to arrive, even more people we didn't know, and by midnight, his house was packed. There were even people outside in the street. Everything got out of control, and the neighbors had to call the police because there was a lot of noise outside, and even people relieving themselves on the sidewalk right in front of the neighbors' houses. There were also people consuming substances. So the police came to shut down the party, and everyone had to leave. Only the closest friends of the host remained. We were 2 more guys and a girl, and of course the host, whom we'll call Kevin to identify him better. It was barely 1:30 in the morning, and we still wanted to have fun. So we started planning to go somewhere else in the city or to another costume party. But Kevin came up with something better. He told us that he had always wanted to explore the psychiatric hospital that was abandoned on the outskirts of the city. He suggested we go explore it and have some beers inside. Everyone agreed except me, as I knew we could get into serious trouble with the police, and I had a student visa but was not an American citizen. I'm Mexican, and at that time I got the visa thanks to my grandmother, who was a citizen and helped me so I could go live with her while I studied. But I knew I shouldn't get into trouble because I risked having my visa taken away. Even so, they convinced me. They told me that no one would catch us because that place is always empty. There are no houses or anything around. It's in a very remote area of the city. So it was either go with them or go back home to my grandmother. And honestly, I wanted to have fun, something I always regret. We went there in Kevin's car. It was already 2 a.m. when we arrived. Just from the outside, the place looked eerie and imposing. It was very big and looked very old. The place only had 3 floors, but it was immensely wide. Everything was completely dark. We had to figure out how we were going to get in since the main doors were closed. First, we made sure there were no security cameras outside, because then we could get into trouble, but there weren't any. The place was completely abandoned. We got out of the car and started walking around the building to find a place to enter, when suddenly our friend, the only girl in the group, said, "Look over there," pointing toward a broken basement window. We all could fit through there, but it would be dangerous because of the glass that was still there. Even so, we decided that we would enter through there. One by one, we began to go down. The place smelled very bad, but that was logical. After so much time abandoned, there were even dead animals inside, and the place was full of garbage. But when we came out into the hallways, they looked almost intact. It was very strange. Only the rooms were dirty, with old stretchers and some rusty surgical tools. Really, it was something too disturbing, like a horror movie. But this was real life, and the atmosphere inside felt truly horrible. We only had 2 flashlights, so we had to stay together to be able to see what those in front were using and not trip over anything. We entered room by room, and the things that were there were truly disturbing. There were electric chairs and things like that. It seemed more like a torture hospital than a psychiatric one. But the worst was yet to come. The more we walked, the more we thought it was better just to look and not touch anything. And although the others didn't care, I paid attention. I was also of that mindset. I knew I shouldn't touch anything because I didn't want anything bad to happen to me later. Just by being there, I knew that horrible things had happened in that place that many of us couldn't even imagine. That's why the vibe was very tense and heavy, and at all times I felt that we were not alone, that there was something in that place watching me. I had a very bad feeling. We walked around and my friends were enjoying it, even making jokes and laughing. Honestly, I felt very nervous and scared at the same time about whatever we might encounter in the end. When we reached the end, there were 2 paths. We took the one on the right first, and that corridor led us to some cells. It seemed that they locked up people there who were dangerous, who were mentally ill, but had committed atrocious acts. In that place, we all began to feel cramps in different parts of the body. The tension of the place was unbearable, but my friends still seemed to enjoy it. No matter how much I told them that we should get out of there, they kept entering cell by cell. Then I saw that my friend, the girl, took the flashlight from Kevin and walked to the cell at the end of the hallway. She didn't say anything to us. She just went alone over there while we were in the cells on the opposite side. I told her to come with us, but she didn't even look at me and kept walking alone until she got there. Then I saw that she entered that last cell and lost sight of her. We continued exploring when suddenly we heard our friend scream and a loud slam of a gate. We all ran over there, but we realized that the cell where she had entered was closed with her inside. We tried to open it, but we couldn't. It even seemed like it was locked, which was illogical since there wasn't even a padlock. We couldn't open it with anything. But the creepiest thing was that she was inside, turned with her back to us, standing without moving or saying anything, silent. "Look at her. What's wrong with her?" Kevin said, referring to our friend. We all started talking to her, telling her to stop playing and that it wasn't funny, but she didn't move. She kept giving us her back, standing in the middle, doing absolutely nothing. She looked so eerie. My friends began to yell at her more and more to stop playing and to come out of there. Meanwhile, we couldn't open it with anything. We panicked. We even thought about calling the police to help us get our friend out of there. But we knew we would end up arrested, and I probably without a visa. But it was the only way to get our friend out. When suddenly she began to move and started speaking with a man's voice, but too macabre, as if her throat were torn. My friends, already scared, told her to stop joking, to stop talking like that, and to come out already. But Kevin told us, "That's not her." At first we couldn't understand what she was saying, but then she started laughing with such horrible laughter. And then she turned around. Her eyes weren't hers. They were someone else's. She had blue eyes, but at that moment they were dark and red around the pupil. She kept laughing and saying senseless things. It seemed she was possessed. Then she started hitting her head against the wall. We were screaming at her to stop, and I started crying seeing that. Never in my life had I seen something like that. It was truly horrible. She fell to the floor or fainted from so much hitting, and then the door opened. We ran in and began to talk to her and move her to wake her up, but she didn't respond. So one of my friends, the strongest one, carried her, and we ran to get out of there and take her to a hospital. But as we walked back through that long hallway, at the end of it, we saw someone standing. It was a man wearing a white coat full of stains, and he was facing us. We had to stop because we didn't know who he was or what his intentions were. He looked terrifying, to be honest. Kevin spoke. He asked him who he was and what he was doing there, but the guy didn't answer. We started getting closer little by little, but when Kevin lifted his face, we almost fainted from fright. The man had no face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. His face was completely smooth. We all started running in the opposite direction, shouting curses from the scare. My friend who was carrying our friend stayed behind because he couldn't run as fast carrying her, so I went back to help him. But when I turned around, that man was no longer there. I shouted to everyone that the guy was gone, so we ran as fast as we could to the place where we had entered. First Kevin went out, then we took our friend out, and then we all came out. My friend woke up when we put her in the car. She was very confused and didn't remember anything that had happened. We told her that we would take her to the hospital, but she didn't want to. She said she was fine, that if we took her, they would call her parents, and they would find out everything. She would be punished, and they could arrest us all for having entered that place. We saw that she was fine. She spoke normally and was already acting as if nothing had happened. So in the end, she convinced us not to do anything, and we went to drop her off at a friend's house to heal her wounds. We went to our homes. On Monday, we went to school and everything seemed normal. My friend looked fine, attended classes normally, and everything had remained a creepy memory. But the next day, she didn't attend classes. We thought she was sick or something similar, but between classes, the principal came to our classroom to give us the news that our friend had passed away. That was the hardest blow I've ever had to endure, as I still feel guilty. Although they said they didn't know the cause of her death, since the autopsy indicated that her heart had simply stopped out of nowhere. It had been a natural but very strange death. It wasn't even due to something in her head. I don't know. Some aftermath from the blows she gave herself that night. No. Simply her heart had stopped out of nowhere without any explanation. All of us who entered that place that night without saying a single word to each other knew what had really happened. Even without having proof, we all thought that her death was because of what happened in that place, as it was too much of a coincidence that it had happened just 2 days later, and without any reason. I missed classes for many days. I couldn't stop crying, blaming myself for what had happened to her, and my other friends were the same. Although we never told anyone what had occurred, we didn't see the point in telling. Let me leave you with this warning. Some places are abandoned for reasons we may never fully understand. Venturing into locations filled with dark energy and entities beyond our comprehension is a risk not worth taking. For a fleeting thrill, you could expose yourself to unimaginable horrors, or bring back something sinister that won't let go. I lost a dear friend because of it. Hi community, my name is Sebastian Reyes and I'm from San Luis Potosi. I'm writing to you because I want to tell you about a very disturbing event that happened to me, my younger brother Victor, and a neighbor we used to hang out with during our childhood named Alex. All of this happened on the night of October 31st, 2006, and I still remember it as if it were yesterday. It turns out that days before, my parents told us that on the 31st, they had been invited to a wedding and asked us if we wanted to go or if we could stay alone at home. Weddings here last until the morning of the next day, and then there's a tornaboda, a post-wedding party, the following day, so they would practically be out all night. We preferred to stay alone at home since I was already 13 years old, and Victor was 11, so we were no longer afraid to be alone in the house. On the contrary, we loved it. We told our friend and neighbor Alex that we would be alone at home on Friday the 31st in case he wanted to stay over to play video games and watch horror movies all night since our parents wouldn't be there. He was very excited and said yes, as he almost always stayed over on Saturdays. He was my age. He was also 13, and we both loved scary things. We always listened to horror radio shows and loved horror and crime movies, so Halloween night was our favorite night. Finally, the day arrived, and my parents left for the wedding around 8 in the evening. Alex arrived at our house around 10, but he was carrying a very large backpack. I made fun of him and asked if he was moving into my house, but I was surprised when I saw that he pulled out a Ouija board from his backpack. "We're going to play at midnight," Alex told me. At that moment, Victor arrived and got excited upon seeing it. I was somewhat hesitant. I didn't know if we should play it in our house because, since I did believe in those things, I was afraid we would bring something that we couldn't get rid of later. But in the end, they both insisted until they convinced me, and I never should have given in. We waited until midnight. Alex had some candles that he said were needed to play, and that all the lights in the house had to be turned off. So we turned everything off and lit the candles. We were sitting on the floor in the middle of the living room. Alex told us what we had to do for the Ouija to work. He said he had already played it once with his older cousin, who taught him how to play it and said it had worked. The board had moved on its own, and while they were playing, a candle had gone out by itself without any wind. We started to play. At first, it didn't work. I was already getting discouraged because a good while passed without anything happening. But suddenly the board began to wobble slightly. My brother and I got excited and smiled, but then that smile was wiped off our faces in a very horrible way. Alex asked the board things like who it was and to manifest itself in some way, to do something so we would know it was there. When suddenly, a vase that was in the middle of the coffee table fell to the floor, shattering instantly. The candles began to go out one by one, and that's when my brother was already scared and told us to stop. I told Alex that we should stop playing, that we had seen enough. He tried to end the game and turn on the light, but it wouldn't turn on. Suddenly, my dog, who was in the yard, began to bark very anxiously, scratching at the door wanting to come in, and he had never done anything like that. But Alex told us not to let him in because whatever was there with us could harm him. So we stayed sitting without doing anything, trying to end the game. But the lights still wouldn't turn on, and my dog wouldn't stop barking. Then a horrible smell began, like a fetid odor inside the house that we didn't know where it was coming from. Victor almost vomited. We covered our noses because the smell was truly unbearable. I got up to open the windows, but when I looked outside, I noticed that the houses around mine seemed abandoned, and the street was too dark, without any noises of any kind, as if we were in another place. It was so strange and unsettling. I called them to come and see, and my brother began to get agitated. He started to breathe in a very desperate way that I even thought something was going to happen to him. So I took the phone to call my parents, but there was no dial tone, and back then we didn't have cell phones. So we thought about leaving the house to go to Alex's place to ask his mother for help, but we couldn't open the door either. It seemed stuck and couldn't be opened with anything. We also tried to open the back patio door where my dog was, but it couldn't be opened either. We had no way out. The windows had bars, so we were trapped inside my house. I tried to calm my brother. I hugged him, telling him that everything was going to be okay, even though in my mind I didn't think that at that moment. But I acted brave so that he would see me and calm down. Meanwhile, Alex put the Ouija back in its box and threw it out the window. The atmosphere was horrible, a feeling of horror that I wouldn't wish on anyone. It felt like something was there with us, a disturbing presence, and that smell that wouldn't go away even with the windows open. My dog barking nonstop, and us sitting there on the living room sofa, just hugging each other. And suddenly I heard something that left me frozen. "I'm here now, Sebastian. Come with me," said someone with the voice of my deceased grandmother from the second floor. My brother started crying again. I also wanted to, but I held back with all my might. I told Alex that it was my grandmother's voice. that he knew she had passed away 4 years ago, but he replied, "That's not your grandmother." I knew that. I knew from the moment I heard her voice that it wasn't my grandmother. I knew it was something evil that wanted me to go up to the second floor, and its malevolence could be felt in the air. I took my brother and Alex by the hands and told them that we should start praying the Our Father non-stop. I knew it was the only thing that could help us. So we began to do it out loud and repeatedly. And then the voice of what appeared to be my grandmother turned into the squeal of a pig. It was the most chilling thing I've ever heard in my life, like someone was hurting a pig in a very cruel way, and the pig was crying non-stop. It's the best way I can describe that horrifying sound. And after that, footsteps began to be heard on the stairs, and that's when the three of us ran toward the door and tried to open it with all our might, screaming and crying. My brother was screaming for help out the window, but it seemed like there was no one in the entire block, as if it were abandoned and we were the only ones there. My dog started hitting the door to get in. He knew we were in danger and wanted to protect us, but none of the doors could be opened. And suddenly the footsteps stopped being heard, as if that thing was already on the ground floor, very close to us. I took my brother and pulled Alex behind the island that was in the middle of the kitchen and told them not to make any noise. We were sitting there, my brother trembling, and his tears wouldn't stop running down his cheeks, but trying with all his might not to make noise because we knew that it was there in the living room looking for us. My heart was beating too fast. I was just praying in my mind and asking God for forgiveness for having played that. I promised him that if he saved us from that, I would go to church every Sunday. And while I was doing that, the voice of my grandmother was heard again. "Don't be afraid, Sebastian. I've come for you." I couldn't help but scream with all my might, telling it to get out and leave us alone. But then I looked up, and in a cabinet, I saw a bottle where my mother kept holy water that the priest from the church had given her. And without looking back so as not to see anything that could make me faint, I got up as quickly as I could and opened the cabinet, taking the holy water and throwing it behind me. The pig's squeal returned, but now it was more intense, like a person crying, but even so, it sounded like a pig. And suddenly, the living room light turned on, and those sounds stopped being heard. The fetid smell vanished out of nowhere, and my dog stopped barking. It was as if everything had returned to normal. Very slowly, we got up from the floor and turned around. Everything was as if nothing had happened. But as we walked toward the living room, we saw the Ouija board lying on the floor outside its box. The first thing I did was open the front door and run out with my brother. The streets were lit up, and in fact, music could be heard in one of the houses. Everything was as if nothing had happened. Everything had returned to normal. We went to Alex's house and we stayed there all night because we were afraid to return to our house. I called my dad from Alex's phone and told him that we were going to stay over at his place to sleep, obviously without mentioning anything that had happened because we knew the scolding we would receive from our parents, as they are very Catholic. Alex had taken the Ouija before leaving my house. He said he couldn't get rid of it, that he was going to return it to his cousin so he could return it or do whatever he wanted with it, but I couldn't even look at it anymore. That night we were saved, but I can't stop wondering what would have happened if the holy water hadn't been there. What would have become of us? I don't even want to imagine it. And even so, that experience marked my childhood and undoubtedly also that of Alex and my brother. It's something you never forget, and it makes you reflect on the foolish things we can do when we're young for a night of fun that could have ended in tragedy. It's okay to be fans of horror and these things, but when we exceed the limits, that's when things we don't want can happen. So be very careful and be smart about what you do. Good night and happy Halloween to everyone.